Hey everybody, I'm Nick Waite with FieldReveal. Today we're out in the field. We're going to take some soil cores from this field, talk about the different properties that we're seeing within these cores, talk about the zones that are in this field and the properties we're seeing in those zones, and then talk about the yield potential within this field as well. The FieldReveal platform utilizes the MZB zone management strategies and other industry-leading technologies to help our ag retailers develop the best nutrient management strategies for their producers to really optimize the inputs that they're putting into their fields. So let's head out to the field, take a look at what we're seeing out here, and discuss some of the properties. Hey everybody, right now we're in a zone 3 within this field. Zone 3s are depressional areas within the field. So we went ahead and pulled the core out of this depressional area. And it's kind of interesting to look at this soil core. We start down here at the bottom area of the core. We see that there's actually a bit of a clay layer here that's preventing the drainage of the water that's coming into this depressional area. Then you look at the top part of this core, we can see that there's very little topsoil and very little organic matter. Understanding that, we see that this area probably would be a lower producing area within this field. Also, we take a look at the actual structure of this, and it's very, very wet and dense and heavy, full of a lot of clay. So using the MZB management strategies, we're able to identify these types of areas and understand that this is a lower producing area of the field that has been probably over applied for a number of years, and we can take those dollars that we would be typically spending on the inputs in this area and shift them over to a higher producing area of the field where we'd have a greater impact on yield. Next zone we're going to talk about is a zone 8. Zone 8s are medium EC, medium texture, and medium producing or medium yield potential. These are transitional zones between some of the other areas within the field. And when we talk about these zone 8s, these are typically the average zones or average yield potential zones that you would have within your fields. Take a look at this core. We see that the top layer of this actually has, some decent topsoils, pretty dark, pretty black, much more organic matter than, like, say, the zone 3 that we discussed earlier. As we go down further into the core, we are seeing a little bit of a plate-like structure here, much more so than we did in that zone 3 previously. That allows for better drainage, which makes sense if we're talking about this is a little bit better producing area within this field. Right now, we're in a zone 5. Zone 5s are a low yielding, medium soil texture zone. And if we take a look at the soil core, we can kind of understand how that relates to this area. The top of the core actually has some fairly decent topsoil, but the bottom of it is a very tight soil full of a lot of clay and still limiting some of that drainage of water through the soil profile. Also, if we think about some of these zone 5s, typically we see these areas that are on the shorelines of depressional areas. And what we often see within the shorelines of depressional areas might be some salt issues. And salt will really limit the type of yield production that we can do within a certain area. And so we need to understand what are our limitations within this zone and what's the best nutrient management strategy for these tougher areas of the field. Next stop here, we're actually in a zone 1. Zone 1s are purely driven off of the elevation layer that we collect during our data collection process. Zone 1s, they're all relative to the field. You look around this field, this is the highest area within this field. Sometimes hilltops can be very good and produce pretty well, while some of the other areas, go over further west into South Dakota, some of the hilltops there become very low producing area of the field. So the one thing you got to remember with our elevation feature zones is that they're all field relative, and they're some of the most important zones. You really have to have that strong agronomic conversation with your producer to understand what's the best strategy that we should put in place when managing these areas within this field. So again, hilltops, we look at this soil core. We actually have fairly decent amount of topsoil across the top. It makes sense for this hilltop. This hilltop has been a long-term no-till field, and so we haven't had as much erosion from wind and rain, and so we've been able to hang on to a little bit of that organic matter and that topsoil. But if we move further down into the profile, we start seeing that the texture actually becomes, pretty coarse. We get a lot of sand within this area. And if you look closely at it, you actually see some of the pebbles within this. It was really interesting when we pulled this core and you watch the impact of the truck taking the soil core. It's a definite impact of the truck lifting off the ground, and a direct correlation to this bottom area of the core here being a little bit tougher piece of ground. So again, the most important thing to take away from a hilltop or any elevation zone within the field is to really understand how that area relates to the rest of the areas within the same field that you're working with. Next zone here that we're going to talk about is a zone 12. So a definition of a zone 12, it's going to be a high yielding area within this field, and it's going to have lower EC, so a little bit lighter soil texture compared to a zone 11. Some things to consider with zone 12, since they do have a little bit lighter soil, is what's the best strategies we should have within this zone. So a couple items to consider are, with a lighter texture soil, we're susceptible to possibly drought conditions if we have a year where we don't have a lot of rainfall. Secondly, the complete opposite, in years where we do have a lot of rainfall, we could become susceptible to some nitrogen leaching. And really, it comes down to having that conversation with your producer and understanding what are the best strategies within this area. So do you consider some in-season nitrogen in years where you have quite a bit of rainfall to take away that effect of nitrogen leaching, or do you consider doing a little bit less population within these areas in years where you might be looking as you're moving into a drought year? So a lot of questions, a lot of opportunities to have discussions about what is the best strategy to manage these types of zones. Again, these are higher producing areas of the field with a lot of potential to them. And so you think about taking some of those input and expenses that we would have in the lower areas or low poor producing areas of the field and putting them into the higher producing areas of fields like this zone 12. We look around here at the residue and the wheat stubble that we see, quite a bit of it, and we can tell that we grew a really good crop within this area of the field. If we look at the soil core, we have a pretty good 6-8 inches, maybe a little bit more of topsoil, a lot of good organic matter within there too. And as we move down further into the profile, we can see that we have a little bit of soil property change. It becomes lighter and lighter. And that's very consistent with what we see with the zone 12s. So really it all comes down to each one of these zones need to have some type of management strategy to them and understanding how they affect your yield potential within this specific field. Next zone that we're going to talk about here is the zone 11. So zone 11s are our high yielding or high yield potential zone and medium EC texture. These areas of the field are some of our best areas within the field, They have some of the highest end use efficiency within these areas as well. Something to think about when you have zone 11s within your field or higher producing zones in your field is think about some of the poorer ground areas or poorer zones that we've talked about before. Maybe our hilltops are a poorer producing area. Maybe our depressions are poorer producing. And so this area here, this zone 11, is a really high yielding area. So let's think about taking some of those inputs that we're putting within those poor areas and maybe shift them over into these high yielding areas where we're going to have the greatest return on investment on those dollars that we can spend and the inputs that we can place in these zones. Something that's really interesting about this zone 11 is that we look around here at the residue. This area is full of crop residue. It grew a really good crop, much more so than compared to the hilltop we were on or the depressional area that we were on as well. Also, looking at the soil core, it's a really nice dark black soil almost all the way through the core itself. There's no hard line or hard stop where the topsoil turns into something else. We see a nice transition almost all the way through that core. Also at the top of it, we can see we have really good organic matter. Just all in all, zone 11, again, that higher producing area, something that you can really take advantage with and optimize the inputs that you're putting into these areas. All right, everybody, that wraps up our tour today of this field. Covered a lot of different topics. Talked about how the FieldReveal platform and the utilization of the MZB zone management strategies was able to identify the different soil properties within this field and develop the zones that were developed within these fields and how they relate and differentiate from each other within this field. And then also finally how that truly affects the overall yield potential of this field as well. We talked about the opportunities that you have of being able to take input dollars from your lower producing areas of the field and shift them into higher areas of your field and really optimize your inputs you're putting in here and get the biggest return on investment that you can when managing these fields. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. I encourage you to, seek out a FieldReveal partner and their local agronomy teams and develop a strategy that works for you in optimizing your inputs and managing your variability within the fields that you may have.